Professor, what you're doing is a great work. Tell us a little bit about where this passion to teach people English comes from.
That's a great question. I think it sort of developed. I didn't actually think I was going to be that exceptional. And I'm not saying I am exceptional, but I didn't think that, when I first undertook this enterprise, that this would be anything unusual. Although, having said that, I did feel I had a message to articulate, at least to the upper intermediate and advanced learners and teachers. I felt I had some insights basically based on my experiences. I wasn't just an English teacher. I'm a history professor. I teach research methods, academic writing. And so, and I'm an active writer. So these are different experiences that the common or average English teacher doesn't have. I'm an active teacher at university, 2 universities. So I've got a lot on my plate, and I've had a lot of experiences, and I've tried to sort of hone the different subjects, teaching skills within those. And so I felt approaching English from a sort of multidisciplinary angle, if I can call it that, would offer something fresh and new. And indeed, it's sort of seems like that's been the case.
Well, that's great. So I see in your video a huge diversity of lessons, but what caught my attention is pronunciation. So just to tease you, is pronunciation that important in English? But I want you to clarify to people why, and probably here, me and you are going to be biased. Do you think pronunciation is essential and important and in the core of language learning? And if yes, why?
Okay, so this can be a simple question, or it can be very complex. I'm going to adopt a simple upfront answer, and then we're going to, I think, elaborate upon it. So ultimately, pronunciation isn't important if they understand what you're saying. But in reality, it can be important. So if you give me just a minute, I'll explain my answer.
Okay, great.
I have the following position. So I hold these pronunciation classes every Sunday live on Instagram, free to help people. Here's my philosophy on why you should be there, for one of 2 reasons. One, people actually can't understand what you're saying because your pronunciation, a thick accent or whatever you want to call it, is inhibiting the communication process. That's the most serious case. And that is definitely a candidate for someone who needs to sort of improve their ability to articulate in English. The second case is more, it's more personal. You just, people want to improve their accent or their, let's call it pronunciation. I don't want to get into this theoretical debate on can you change accents, your pronunciation. And I think that's their prerogative. And I embrace that, and that's fine. Now, here's what I'm not doing. I'm not saying if you come from that country, you should sound like me. If I can understand you, I'm happy with your accent.
Perfect.
I will never suggest that you change your accent, unless I just can't understand a word or two, then we might have to deal with that. But if I can understand you, you have a fine accent. Now, I want to just add one more subtlety to what is a pretty basic answer. And that is that if you have an exceptional accent, and I can say, Waleed, you have a very, very pleasant accent, which is why you're doing what you do on the mic, very pleasant to listen to you. If people have an exceptional or very pleasant accent, it enhances the communication experience. And there's a lot of other issues and sort of, fall offs from that. But that's an extra. That's sort of at the top. And people have good voices, and you can make money with a good voice. So obviously that's not everyone, but people need to know that. And so if they have those sorts of ambitions, then you have to sort of think more seriously about the way you pronounce words.
So, I mean, of course, I have a multifaceted list of questions that probably we can go in any kind of direction here, but I'm tapping on your experience as an English professor, to tell us a little bit of, or a kind of succinctly walk us through the process of learning for adults, because we are challenged here. But just to go back to a very important issue that you have just quite insightfully raised, and that is the marathon or the race after perfecting your accent. And I always constantly tell my students that it's not about the accent, it's about the message that is conveyed. And once your message is comprehended, you're good to go. But within the context of EFL, where English is taught as a second language, where there are, in Chomsky's word, lack of social stimuli, people need to equip themselves with good amount of training to satisfy them over the long span of time where they have lack of exposure to native speakers and non-native speakers to practice their English, because ultimately speaking, English and any sort of language is a mechanical process to convey messages. And once this is not triggered correctly and over a longer span of time, that's going to just make the language atrophy in the mind. However, the point that I wanted to mention, since we're talking about accents, a lot of teachers in Middle East and North Africa and Russia, probably, they try really hard to just perfect their accent to become a role model where there's lack of social stimuli. So probably that is one justification, but that is not satisfactory to the point that we have to make it imperative on learners, to perfect American or British or Australian. There's plethora of accents around the world, and everybody should be proud of the accents where they're coming from. Now, just not to lose my train of thought and go back to square number one, where I asked you, because it's about you more than about me tonight.
I enjoy the dialogue, so thank you.
I want you to tell us the kind of experience that you have with language learning, especially among adults, which is the major challenge that we face as English teachers.
Well, I think the onus, ONUS, for the listeners who might not be familiar with that word, the onus or the burden initially lies with the student. Now, it's our job as a teacher to sort of ask some of the obvious questions that sometimes aren't asked. What is the goal? Why are you learning English? What's the point? Because I think all of the planning and the learning and the direction you head is predicated upon that answer.
Yes.
And to the extent they have a definite or clear answer to that is the extent to which we can offer a good plan. And to be honest, you don't need fancy theories here. It's pretty logical. If someone is needing English for an interview in a job, that you have to focus on spoken English. Now, if that job entails a lot of writing, then of course, now this gets a bit more complicated.
You think that we, as learners, generally speaking, we have to do some sort of like reverse engineering to understand what our target or objective is and play backward to the beginning of checking out?
Yeah, I think you asked about adults. And so I'm assuming adults are people who are working or about to work. And so, and in general, adults are more that might not be true. Some do it just because they want to learn. They want to speak English on holiday.
Well, it can be some statistical generalization to be made here.
Go for it. What?
It can, I mean, whatever you wanted to say here, it can be statistically generalized to some extent. That's what I wanted to say.
Yes. I mean, there are numbers. I don't have them to hand, but I think we just ask the students what their goals are. If it's to go on holiday and speak English and order a Big Mac without making errors, that's fine. If it's to interview for a job, I mean, that's a different approach. And I think ultimately, but there are a lot of psychological issues. I think more psychological issues with adults than you have with young learners who actually don't know that they should be nervous, and so there's that aspect of it that adults are aware of, but they might not be able to overcome so easily.
I think there's some latency between the point that you pause and the point I start. So I'm sorry if there is if it comes across as rudeness, but I'm not interrupting you as much as there is this latency going on. What I wanted to say is within the adult team, there's always this dichotomy of, let's say, this debate of whether the kind of major issues that they have with learning or the impediment of learning comes from a psychological background or cognitive background.
Oh, I see.
I get a lot of people, especially when I teach. I'm teaching right now 15 employees from the Ministry of Defense, and they say we have some memory degradation and we cannot learn, and we have this blah blah blah, and I think my memory is just dying because I'm getting older, so I don't think I'm going to be able to learn. Prove me wrong. And once we start learning and we start, going back and refresh it, their memory, they start to come to this final realization that the language spectrum is not restricted to grammar per se, but there are other aspects that can be perceived and used. And it just comes down to the amount of practice that they have. So what is your comment on this issue particularly? Do you think adults suffer from psychological implications or cognitive, and why?
Well, first of all, I think you have a pretty good understanding on this topic. Perhaps, well, I'm certain a lot more than I do. I'm not teaching adults in careers at the moment. I'm a university professor, and admittedly, my students are mainly fluent. So
yeah, that's great.
I'm not dealing with these psychological impediments, to borrow your word. I'm dealing with different impediments of a psycho-emotional nature, and that's just sort of complacency and motivation, which is different. Honestly, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask for this. My guess, because we have these debates in all aspects and corners of academia in every field, is that there's some truth in both theories, that you've got cognitive issues and you've got these other sets of issues that you've mentioned. Cognitive decline, where they just don't think as sharply as they did 30 years ago. That is, I think, seems to me from a distance, pretty logical. But then you've got these other issues. I don't know what you call, I forget what you call it, emotional or psychological
cognitive
issues. Yeah.
That leads me to another question, which is about your approach. Now, allow me to ask, how many do you have, particularly in this level you're teaching?
Between 15 and 20.
So what is your approach, starting from the beginning? Like, how much time do you spend with them per day and per week? And what is you have an excellent approach, and this is coming from the way I can see you design and the simplicity of the presentation and the rhetorics of your speech when it comes to delivery of something, and the real clear and beautiful accent, quote unquote, that you use. So, or that you have. So what is your approach to teach English to this group of people?
Okay, well, keep in mind that I'm teaching different classes. So I have a history course, I have a research methods course, I have a culture course, a history of the United States, and I also teach academic writing and academic skills. But I don't teach as such pure English, although everything about it is English, and I do teach the language. So for example, in the academic skills, where we're talking about, basic research types things, I introduce new words, I use them in their common context or collocations, because I understand that words by themselves are going to just wash off their, their memory. And so I try to get them I don't just repeat it, I try to get them to sort of use it as well. So, moving from passive to active, these sorts of traditional sort of techniques where, well, for example, in writing, we have an opinion piece we're doing next week. I have them write 150 words. They will stand up and deliver that. They don't know who, but 5 or 6 will stand up and deliver that in oral form. And so we're mixing the sort of forms of communication. I think this is a great way to develop both skills and sort of lend a bit of confidence to one skill over another. I'm not answering your question directly because I'm not teaching B1 to move them to B2. Yes. It's a different issue for me, unfortunately. It's basically advanced students teaching them different skills in, through the language or, through the faculty of English.
So ostensibly, what I'm seeing here is an eclectic approach where you have a hybrid method of presenting multiple skills at the same time, considering the fact that your maneuverability in the classroom is higher with the level. So there is some sort of correlation between their level, advanced level, and the kind of materials that you're presenting to them. And the reason I ask this is because I am tapping on your experience to see a different dimension or perspective of how you teach English, and I can see.
Well, I can. Okay, I think I know where we're headed here. I can give you my general view or theory on teaching.
That would be generous of you.
And this runs through every course, whether it's English, writing, history, it doesn't matter. Research methods. I taught last year a doctoral course. I've given guest lectures to university faculty on publishing. So through all of these, it's the same, and that is that communication involves, I'm simplifying it now to the 2 areas I can control most, and that is language and ideas. These are 2 areas that I have a lot of control over. I'm not so good at the psychological, emotional aspects, mainly because I meet these students 1 time a week for an hour. You asked about frequency earlier, so I offer that. So for me, it's important what they say, and then we can make it beautiful. The onus, the burden on me is to develop the mind.
Okay, great.
And I don't think you have to be a university teacher to do this. I think it should start young with basic questions on why do you think they're having more fun than anyone else? These little baby photos, these little kid photos. It can start at 5 or 6, and I have experience practicing this method. I say method. It's just getting people to think below the surface. And I go as low as they're prepared to think. But initially, all students, and to be honest, most adults, think on a very superficial level. They offer an idea that's not very interesting or pretty obvious, mundane. And so it's our job to equip them to think more deeply, because at the end of the day, the students that I'm preparing want to have international careers or a significant position in a company locally. This requires great ideas. You can have the perfect grammar, great syntax in the interview. You will not get the great job if you don't have interesting ideas. And I try to make that point very clearly, and I show it all the time. 2 ways I show it. I model it by showing them, I do the examples I ask them to do, and I show them, I just model better ideas. That's the first thing, but it's taken many years. It's not that I'm a genius. I have to work hard at it, but I've done it for 35. I'm writing for 30 years now. So I get, sorry, 20 years. So it's sort of, I have an advantage of time and experience. That's the first thing. I model it and say, look, this is what's possible. And the second thing is then I criticize in a very gentle way their own ideas. Is that really logical? Have you thought about that? Getting them to think in a more vertical rather than horizontal manner.
So can we say you are biased to writing or productive skills in general?
Yeah, well, I think speaking as well, though. If you're giving a presentation, if it isn't well structured, if you don't have anything to say that's interesting, that presentation or report, if you're giving a report to the board of directors or whatever your boss, it's the same issue. It's going to be it's going to have the same effect, whether it's in written form or oral form. And this is what I try to do, is show them with every skill that there's a practical application where in your future, if you think seriously about it, this is very much necessary. So I try to show that skill, and I genuinely try to do it. I'm not just saying it. This skill, I say it in this manner, very directly. Let me tell you why this is important. Because imagine you're giving a speech. So we did work on sources and, source criticism, and, your speech is as good as your sources, and this sort of very general idea. So if you have poor sources, you're going to have a problem if you have a critical audience. Now, if you don't have a critical audience, you might get away with it. But in my experience, the people who matter most are the best thinkers. They have the best ideas, and they're going to have the most informed opinions about your reputation and your delivery. So I don't think it's just writing, but you're right. It's these active communication skills. But of course, it bleeds into, reading, because you develop your ideas in two ways, your critical thinking in two ways. Either it's modeled by you, by your teacher or your boss, or you're reading a really interesting writer who shows you a different way to think about something.
So over the trajectory of 20 plus years that you had, teaching and experiencing, what was the most influential element that just changed and triggered this kind of deep thinking in you, Professor? Is it writing? Is it reading? Is it social contacts? Is it the elite kind of people that you meet? Or is it something different? Maybe that is going to enlighten us to probably invest more time as scholars in this domain and try to investigate it more, since you're ahead of us by miles, probably, in this category of thinking and critical thinking and deep thinking. So I'm tapping on your, rich and great experience in this domain.
Well, I'm not sure how rich it is, but I can tell you that's a great question, by the way. I think there are multiple sources. Now, I had the luck, I'll call it luck. There's a lot of luck involved. I studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and my professor at Cambridge and Oxford were they were the doyens. And for those listening, DOYEN is the head or sort of unofficial leader in any academic field. They were doyens in their field. One held the top position in history in Oxford. The other was the most prolific writer in my field in all of the English language world. And these are both historians. So I was motivated by the social environment.
What's the name of the second, if I may ask? David Crystal or somebody else?
Well, okay, so I did history. David Crystal does more the history of the English language. I do history of Europe. Okay. But I've read David Crystal, and he, of course, he's very interesting and very, had a great impact on how we see English in its context. But I did more European history. But so it was, I can just tell you, Eamon Duffy was my supervisor in Cambridge, and Professor R.J.W. Evans was in Oxford, the Regis Professor, which is the highest position in the department. So I was very lucky. I worked hard, but a lot of it's luck as well. So I had exposure, on a regular basis to towering figures, not only in, the university, but in just general thinking. And so I was immediately challenged. I immediately understood that I am not very smart and I need to up my game. Yeah. And then secondly, the people you're around, the friends you meet, they're quite, they're gifted. They challenge you. The books I read challenged me. And then, of course, I can just personally, where I probably gained the most traction or, saw the most results is my own writing. I just wrote a lot of bad pieces that they excoriated or criticized roundly. And I got better through trial and error, just made a lot of mistakes. I've been benefited by, publishing or submitting to publication about 30 articles. You get great feedback from international publishers. I've got an article, a chapter due in the Cambridge History series this spring, and these editors and reviewers give you great feedback. So I'm constantly a student. I'm not the teacher in these situations. It's a great position to be in. I'm learning.
My professor told me, he told me that writing is a process. It's not a product. So probably this is going in alignment with what you have just nicely stated. And probably you've just said it in a greater way, that having contact and supervision by doyens and great people and socializing, getting peer review, just to paraphrase what you have just said, and your personal effort can lead you to where you want to be. And this is exactly what I was expecting from a great professor like you here. And it's actually really privileged. I don't want to take your probably relaxing time today. It's a great opportunity to talk to you, Professor, and hopefully this is not our last meeting. And you can be a beacon to millions of people, actually. And what you're doing, probably you're getting told this on a daily basis, but what you're doing is great. You're working as a beacon to people who are trying to learn English, and probably they are lost in this big market of books and sources, and you're just making everything simpler. So this is something that I'm carrying to you from downtown Baghdad to tell you that you're doing great, whether you're in Moscow or you're on the other side of the hemisphere. So thank you so much, Professor. It's a great privilege. Hopefully we'll stay in touch. And if you are willing to present another topic, I'm always there, just one message away to get in touch.
Thank you, Walid. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we can continue this dialogue in the near future. Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor, and we'll stay in touch. I'll send you the link to everything that I will do with this video later when I finish the editing.